You see her across the room, don't you? That confident smile, those calculated glances. You think it's attraction, but it's assessment. You believe it's connection, but it's conquest. And Plato, perhaps the greatest mind to ever contemplate human nature, tried to warn you, not with gentle suggestions or comforting half-truths, but with the unflinching clarity of a philosopher who spent his life dissecting the human soul. Plato's entire existence was devoted to understanding what he called the forms, the perfect, eternal templates that our imperfect world merely imitates. And he discovered something profoundly disturbing about certain women. He discovered that they don't just interact with men, they weaponize them, transform them, reduce them to tools in their own psychological arsenal. And the most terrifying part? Most men walk willingly into this trap, believing they've found love when they've merely found a master. You might think she's choosing you for your authentic self, but what she's actually selecting is your utility, your function, your role in her carefully constructed narrative, a psychological prop who exists to validate her self-image. And when you cease to serve that function, she doesn't change her expectations. She changes you, or she replaces you. Plato identified this as a manifestation of the tyrannical soul, a person governed not by reason or virtue, but by insatiable desire and the relentless pursuit of pleasure. In his masterwork, The Republic, he didn't soften this reality. He described it as a form of internal slavery, a state where the woman herself becomes unaware that she's no longer acting from wisdom, but from the chaotic impulses of her most primitive desires. And men, you fall for it because you were never taught to recognize it. You mistake being desired with being respected. You confuse being pursued with being valued. You believe her declarations of uniqueness when, in reality, you're just the latest vessel she's selected to contain her unexamined emptiness. And when the illusion shatters, when her interest evaporates like morning dew, you're left disoriented, wounded, and humiliated, questioning your own worth. But you did nothing wrong. You simply stopped being a useful character in her private drama. Plato warned that the only escape from this psychological theater is through what he termed the examined life, the relentless, uncomfortable process of questioning your assumptions and confronting your own nature. And here's the brutal truth. Most men never begin this journey. You've been conditioned to seek external validation, to measure your worth through the eyes of others, to let women determine your value. And as long as you continue, you'll repeat this cycle endlessly, discarded whenever you no longer serve her narrative. Self-examination isn't pleasant, it's excruciating. It demands that you face the aspects of yourself you've denied, the weakness, the neediness, the fear. It requires that you stop blaming women for using you and start understanding why you allow yourself to be used. Because here's what Plato knew that most men will never grasp. You don't become worthy by being chosen. You become worthy by living according to principle, regardless of who chooses you. You don't derive your value from her attention. You establish it by standing firm in your truth, fully aware, fully responsible, fully engaged with reality. A man who has truly examined himself cannot be manipulated by emotional appeals. He is no longer a pawn in someone else's game. He is the architect of his own existence. Plato observed that the greatest tragedy of modern men is not that they are rejected, but that they are willing to distort themselves into whatever shape they believe will earn acceptance. You call it compromise. You call it relationship. You call it love. But Plato had another name for it: self-betrayal. He cautioned that men who neglect their own philosophical development become captives to unexamined passions, twisting themselves like malleable metal into the forms demanded by women who themselves are guided only by appetite and opinion rather than wisdom. You cease being men and become performances, smiling, agreeing, accommodating, pretending until you forget who you were before the performance began. And women, they perceive this weakness. They sense it with an almost preternatural awareness. The very qualities you believe will secure her affection, compliance, predictability, constant availability become the precise reasons she loses respect. Why? Because the feminine instinct, as Plato recognized, isn't drawn to servitude. It's drawn to strength, to principle, to the man she cannot easily bend to her will. The moment you surrender your boundaries, your autonomy, your self-respect, you don't become more desirable. You become irrelevant, forgettable, exchangeable. And yet, here's the contradiction that keeps most men enslaved. You fear solitude more than you fear falsity. You'd rather lose your integrity than lose her companionship. You'd rather live as a reflection than face the discomfort of defining yourself. But Plato taught that, until a man embraces that philosophical solitude, he will never know freedom. He argued that the examined life requires you to die to illusion before you die physically, to allow the false constructs of your identity to dissolve so that something authentic might finally emerge. But let me tell you what no one wants to acknowledge. The examined life is isolating, profoundly isolating. Because as you walk that path, you begin to perceive realities you cannot unsee. You begin to recognize the games people play, the roles they adopt, the comforting lies they tell themselves to avoid confronting truth. And when you attempt to share these insights, they resent you. They label you cold, detached, judgmental. They identify you as the problem, but you're not the problem. You're the mirror, and people despise the mirror when it reflects what they're determined to ignore. Plato understood this intimately. He documented the fate of his teacher Socrates, who was executed not for spreading falsehoods, but for compelling citizens of Athens to question their cherished beliefs. And certain women, Plato noted, are particularly resistant to this kind of examination. They are socialized in environments that reward them for emotional expressiveness rather than rational inquiry. They are told they are intuitive, nurturing, and complete exactly as they are. But Plato rejected this notion. He argued that the greatest danger to women was their unexamined appetites, the internal forces that speak with false certainty, false entitlement, and false moral authority. He warned that if a woman does not subject these impulses to rational scrutiny, she becomes their prisoner, projecting them onto every man she encounters, holding them accountable for battles she refuses to fight within herself. And here you stand, believing you're her salvation, convinced you'll be the exception, certain that if you just demonstrate sufficient devotion, accommodate enough demands, fulfill enough expectations, she'll finally appreciate you for your essence rather than your utility. But that's not how unconscious patterns operate. Plato taught that unexamined assumptions act as invisible prison bars. They confine perception, replacing reality with illusion. And until both men and women liberate themselves from these unconscious patterns, they are doomed to reenact the same tragedy repeatedly, each blaming the other, neither recognizing they're both captives of their own unconsidered beliefs. And here emerges the most painful irony of all. The woman who once viewed you as indispensable will eventually see you as inadequate, not because you've deteriorated, but because you failed to fulfill the impossible ideal she projected onto you. And she'll have no awareness she's doing this. Plato called this philosophical blindness inevitable when neither party takes responsibility for examining their own assumptions. You didn't deceive her, you didn't abandon her. You simply couldn't embody the perfect form of manhood she unconsciously demanded you personify. You were never that ideal to begin with, and that's precisely why she grows dissatisfied, not for your actual limitations, but for failing to be the impossibility she never articulated but always expected. Plato famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And nowhere is the cost of that unexamined life more evident than in romantic entanglements. Both men and women enter these arrangements not as self-aware individuals, but as walking bundles of unexamined expectations, dragging their unprocessed disappointments, unrecognized needs, and unresolved wounds into the embrace of another person they scarcely comprehend. You call it connection. Plato called it mutual delusion. And like sleepwalkers, you keep stumbling into the same pattern, expecting different results. But nothing changes because you have not yet asked the most destabilizing question a man can pose to himself. What if I am perpetuating this cycle? You want to condemn women. You want to label them manipulative, calculating, superficial. But Plato would fix you with his penetrating gaze and ask, and why do you continuously select women who treat you as a means rather than an end? You see, the man who refuses to examine his own motivations is destined to be used by those who understand them better than he does himself. You are not a victim. You are a participant. You chose to play the fool. You chose to be the supporting actor in her psychological theater, because confronting your own emptiness, your own lack of self-definition, was far more frightening than performing a role in someone else's narrative. And this is where most of you will disengage, because this is where comfort ends and responsibility begins. Plato didn't offer simple formulas. He didn't provide 3 actionable steps to becoming an alpha male. He presented the demanding, lifelong discipline of critical self-reflection, of sitting alone with the contents of your own mind until the illusions begin to disintegrate, until the voice that insists you need external validation to be complete begins to fade. And make no mistake, that voice will resist extinction. It will insist that you require her, that you are insufficient without her, that no man can exist without feminine approval. But Plato's philosophy suggests something more revolutionary. It suggests that the man who can exist without seeking approval, without requiring admiration, without needing to be needed, is the man who has achieved true freedom. Freedom from manipulation, freedom from performance, freedom from the exhaustion of living as someone else's idealized projection. And when you reach that state, you don't become cold or distant. You become authentic. You become grounded, centered, fully present in your own experience. And that is when, paradoxically, women will feel most powerfully drawn to you. Not because you require them, but because you don't. And you'll understand, not with bitterness, but with clarity, that she is navigating her own journey too, that she must examine her own assumptions, that she must awaken from her own unquestioned beliefs. And you cannot do that work for her. You cannot rescue her from herself. You can only do what Plato did. You can pursue your own philosophical path with such integrity that you become a living demonstration of the examined life, reflecting truth back to everyone courageous enough to see it. Most will turn away, but a rare few will express gratitude. And that is the distinction between being desired for the role you perform and being respected for the man you've become. And when that moment arrives, when you finally realize you no longer need to pretend, you'll begin to notice something disquieting. You'll observe how uncomfortable your authenticity makes others. They'll detect it, even if they cannot articulate it. The weight of your self-possession will disturb them, because you no longer conform to the predictable patterns they rely upon for security. Plato warned that the philosopher is not celebrated by society. He is feared, misunderstood, characterized as aloof or arrogant. But the reality is more threatening. You have simply become impervious to manipulation, incorruptible, immune to control because you perceive the mechanics of the game. And here's where the ultimate irony emerges. The very people who once demanded your attention, your reassurance, your submission, they'll begin to resent you for not requiring theirs. Women, particularly those still governed by unexamined appetites, will accuse you of being emotionally unavailable. They'll claim you're too cerebral, too rational, too independent. But what they're really articulating is that they can no longer influence you. You've departed from their script. You've ceased reciting their lines. And without that script, they have no idea how to engage with you because you've stopped being a character and started being a man. Plato once observed that what the masses call reality is merely shadow play, projections on the wall of a cave mistaken for substance. And make no mistake, men pursuing validation are the most philosophically impoverished of all. You think you're expressing devotion when you declare, "I live for her," or "She gives my life meaning." But Plato would regard you with pity and explain that what you call love is actually an abdication of philosophical responsibility. It's simpler to project your purpose onto a woman and make her the repository of your meaning, your direction, your sense of self. Because if she carries these, you don't have to define them for yourself. But here's the devastating consequence. When she recognizes she was never designed to bear the weight of your existential purpose, she will relinquish it. She must relinquish it because no woman, regardless of her capacity for compassion, can sustain the burden of a man who refuses to bear himself. And when she releases it, you'll experience betrayal. But you shouldn't. You should express gratitude, because in that moment when the illusion collapses, you finally confront the reality that the work of becoming a man was never her responsibility. It was invariably yours. And in that raw moment of recognition, you face a critical choice. You can blame her. You can surrender to bitterness. You can join the resentful chorus of men who direct their accusations at women, deriding them, condemning them, rejecting them like cowards who never dared to face their own philosophical vacancy. Or you can do what Plato would have demanded of you. You can turn inward. You can initiate the solitary, challenging, liberating practice of self-examination, of achieving wholeness without requiring someone else to complete you. Because the truth is, the woman you're seeking externally is a projection of the part of yourself you've neglected. Until you confront that aspect, every relationship will be transactional, every connection superficial, every love an illusion. But when you do face it, when you integrate your own capacity for depth, you become a man who no longer needs to pursue women. You don't chase after them. You don't strategize to win them. You don't perform to impress them. You stand secure, fully established in your nature. And from that foundation, something extraordinary occurs. You no longer attract women who desire a performance. You attract women who desire reality. And you'll recognize it immediately because she won't require you to portray a role. She won't attempt to revise your script. She won't fall for a fantasy of who you might become. She'll stand before you, authentic and present, not as an ideal demanding worship, but as a human being willing to walk her own philosophical path alongside yours. No pretense, no projections, no games. And when you meet her, the authentic her, not the illusion, you'll perceive the difference instantly. She won't overwhelm you with dramatic professions. She won't treat you as the missing component in her incomplete existence. She won't seduce you with promises of fulfillment because she isn't seeking to be fulfilled. She isn't looking to be saved. She's done the work. She's faced her own shadow. She's examined her own assumptions. She's dissolved her own illusions. And that's precisely why she won't demand your performance. She won't expect you to carry her existential weight. She'll stand there containing herself, meeting your gaze. Not as a man she intends to mold, but as a man she is finally prepared to know. And in that knowing, there is no desperation. There is no grasping. There is no performance. There is only truth. And that truth, Plato taught, is the rarest and most profound form of love. The kind that asks nothing but offers everything. Because it isn't born of need. It is born of freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to depart, freedom to remain together without illusions, without disguises, without fear. But let me caution you, most of you will never experience this because most of you will abandon the path before reaching its destination. You'll accept the performance. You'll embrace the fantasy. You'll settle for the momentary thrill of being desired as someone you are not, because confronting who you truly are remains unbearable. But if you possess the courage, the relentless, soul-shaking courage to persist, to stand alone, to strip away every false layer you've constructed to gain approval, you will eventually find yourself at the threshold of something terrifyingly authentic. You will find yourself, and when you do, women will no longer define your existence. They will no longer be the mirrors you use to glimpse your reflection. They will become something else entirely. Companions, not possessions. Equals, not pedestals. Partners, not saviors. And you will engage with them not because you require them, but because you choose to. From a position of strength, from a place of completeness, from an identity that recognizes without apology who you are. Plato didn't leave you a roadmap to follow. He left you an admonition, a warning that every man who refuses to examine himself will become enslaved to the unchecked desires of others, especially the desires of certain women. But he also left you an invitation, a challenge to walk the path of philosophical inquiry, to stop condemning women for the roles you volunteer to play, to stop seeking validation in someone else's perception, to stop waiting to be chosen, because the man who chooses himself fully, uncompromisingly, consistently, is the man who cannot be controlled by fantasy. He cannot be seduced by flattery. He cannot be reduced to a utility in someone else's narrative. He becomes the author of his own existence.